Okay. Well, good evening, everybody. My name's John Horrigan. Welcome to this lecture on the Quabbin Reservoir. In this edition, we're going to learn about Boston's drinking water, Westwood's drinking water, why Boston was settled. And I bet you I'm going to catch you on this one. You don't know why Boston was settled. It was for a particular spring, and we're going to talk about that. But we'll go over the history of water being pumped into Boston. If you don't know me, that's fine. I'm the host, writer, and winner of 5 Boston New England Emmy Awards for a show called The Folklorist. You can find it at www.folklorist.tv or go to YouTube and plug in The Folklorist. It was recorded out of New TV in Newton, Massachusetts. So, and I've been lecturing on history for over 30 years across North America. I'm also a professional sports announcer with the Boston Bruins alumni. If you're ever interested in the old retired guys, I've been working with them for nearly 30 years. You can go to bostonbruinsalumni.com. There, that's me. And I live with my wife and 2 cats. And I will warn you, one of my cats may yowl in the background or even might jump up. We'll see. So we're going to talk about Boston's fresh water, creation of the Quabbin Reservoir, the history of the area, and touring Quabbin. I got to, in 2020, from Labor Day through Columbus Day, I created my own Tour de France. I called it Tour de Quabbin. I had 21 stages, just like the Tour de France, and I ended up walking 126 miles at different gates at the Quabbin. What a refreshing experience. Nobody around, headphones off, listen to the birds. It was just a marvelous experience. If you get a chance to go to Quabbin Reservoir, do it, especially in the autumn. Spectacular in October. Okay. So we, as Americans, we take our fresh water for granted and our clean water for granted. But 1 of 8 people in the world do not have access to fresh, clean water. And like the ancient Romans, American settlers built aqueducts to bring water into their communities. And by the way, the photographs you're going to be seeing about are of the Quabbin Reservoir for the most part. But the majority of fresh water on Earth is in the ice caps. And the source of almost all fresh water is precipitation from the atmosphere in the form of mist, rain, and snow. And fresh water falling as mist, rain, or snow contains materials dissolved from the atmosphere and material from the sea and land over which the rain-bearing clouds have traveled. I'm not going to get into it, but it's rained frogs before and fishes in some areas, anomalous rain. Sometimes there's been blood-red snow in areas and the like. So, in industrialized areas, rain is typically acidic because of dissolved oxides of sulfur and nitrogen formed from burning of fossils in cars, factories, trains, and aircraft. And these are coming from the atmospheric emissions of industry. And you can see the depiction to the right there, just showing you how the pollutants get into rain, into clouds, and then it comes back into Earth. And you heard the term acid rain, I'm sure, back in the, if you're not as old as me, 70s and 80s, it was a term. So, and of course, my cat, this is Jake, and he's been fed, so Jaker's, okay, good boy. So in some cases, this acid rain results in pollutions of lakes and rivers. So saltwater droplets can be absorbed into rain-bearing clouds, as do soil components, some with high iron and mineral concentrations, and consequently they taint the purity of the precipitation. The water that we drink, none of it is pure. In fact, the purest water you can find is probably in Iceland or Greenland with the melting of the ice caps. And saline water in oceans, that's water with salt in it, seas and saline groundwater make up about 97% of all the water on Earth. So most of the water on Earth is salt water. And only 2.5 to 2.75% is fresh water, including 1.75 to 2% frozen in glaciers, ice, and snow, and only 0.5 to 0.75% is fresh groundwater and soil moisture, and less than 0.01% of it as surface water in lakes, swamps, and rivers. And of course, we have aquifers that people drill down to underneath the ground. So freshwater lakes contain about 87% of this fresh surface water, including 29% in the African Great Lakes, and then 22% in Lake Baikal in Russia, 21% in the North American Great Lakes, which includes Lake Champlain, and 14% in other lakes. and the atmosphere contains about 0.04% of water. So I throw a lot of numbers at you, but we have to understand clean water, fresh water is a precious commodity, and we take it for granted. So nowadays, with what they put in fluoride and other sorts of chlorine to purify the water, and some of us use pure water filters, I do, for more drinking water. So, but we should really respect our water. So the Pilgrims, and this is a pretty cool story, because they were critically short of fresh drinking water when they came over in the Mayflower, 66 days, right? They left it in September of 1620, and Master Christopher Jones decided to put it in the Mayflower to Provincetown Harbor on November 11th, 1620, because they ran out of beer and drinking water. In those days, the drinking water was polluted, and they could get all sorts of waterborne diseases, but more importantly, they ran out of beer. And they chose this area here on November 16th, 1620, 5 days after they threw anchor in the harbor. It was around 10 a.m. when the Pilgrims came into the valley and saw their first deer. And then they also found a spring of fresh water, the first fresh water they had found in New England. So if you want to go on a tour this summer, you could go to where the Pilgrims landed in Provincetown, where they first slept. Corn Hill, there's a secret marker there. First Encounter Beach, the fresh spring water, and more. So this is the marker at the first spring, the fresh spring, where the Pilgrims settled. This is where they had their first drink of water. And the plaque reads, found November 16th, Anno Domini 1620, by an exploring party sent by the first body politic. Amongst them were Edward Winslow, Miles Standish, and no jakers. There were no cats on the first Mayflower. But it says, about 10 o'clock we came into a deep valley full of brush, wood gale, and long grass, through which we found little paths or tracks, and there we saw a deer, and found springs of fresh water, and this is great here, of which we were heartily glad, and sat us down and drunk our first New England water with as much delight as ever we drink in all our lives. That's nice. But I recommend they're a nice park. If you can get down there, it would be a great tour. So that's Quabbin Reservoir. So here is Pilgrim Spring Trail. And again, you can find all of these Pilgrim Spring Trail. Corn Hill, where they found the corn for the first time. First Encounter Beach, where they landed in Provincetown. There's all sorts of markers where they slept for the first time and had their first bonfire. But you can do it in an afternoon and end the day in Provincetown for a nice hot dog or hamburger at John's Footlong Hot Dogs. My favorite place. All right, so today this area is known as Pilgrim Spring Trail and Pilgrim Heights in North Truro, Massachusetts. And why'd they settle Patuxet, Plymouth Plantation? It's because of this, the Town River. When they made landfall at the tip of Cape Cod, they were reluctant to settle there because there was no fresh water that they could find on Cape Cod, too sandy. So what they did, they sailed across the mainland, and of course, the Great Dying, which took place from 1614 to 1619, had wiped out the Native American population. In fact, my theory is that there are two ground zeros, two epicenters. Northern Maine, where the plague or whatever it was brought ashore by a French trapper. But I also think because of the devastation that Patuxet was hit, and I believe it was somebody from John Smith's party, the other ship known as Thomas Hunt. Another lecture on another day. And people are starting to buy into this theory, at least some of my historian friends. Anyways, they described and they sailed across to the mainland to Patuxet, and they observed what one person described as, quote, a very sweet brook fed by cool springs, as good water as can be drunk. So that's why they settled there. This is Town River, and having kayaked in that from Billings Pond, from the Billington Sea, actually it's called, it's really just boggles my mind to think this is why you and I are here in this region, on this continent. So at the brook's mouth was a salt marsh where the colonists could anchor their boats, so the Pilgrims built their houses near the fresh water supply. It makes sense. That's a lane, by the way. You see plenty of these lanes at the Quabbin Reservoir. And the thing is, when you're walking down, you don't realize you're going down. On the way back, there's these ascending hills, and it's a bit of an effort. So there's Town Brook. So Town Brook is fed by the Billington Sea, and it's the reason why the Pilgrims chose Patuxet, Plymouth as their settlement. What if, though? What if they didn't find the fresh water? They probably had gone more northern to New Hampshire or Maine. So now, Boston. This is from the Next Phase blog of March 17th. Aline Kaplan wrote this, and she did a fabulous job. So I'm going to quote her directly. This is Aline Kaplan, March 2017. When the Puritans sailed into Boston Harbor in 1630 under the leadership of John Winthrop, they set foot first in what is now Charlestown. Now, Charlestown was laid out in 1629 by engineer Thomas Graves, one of the earliest settlers in the reign of Charles I of England, and it was originally a separate town and the first capital of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So John Smith, backing up, discovered the Charles River and sailed into Boston Harbor in 1614, and he renamed the Quabbin, which was the Native American name for the Charles River, he renamed it after King Charles I. So this area only had brackish water, though, in Charlestown, and it made it unsuitable for building a colony or building a small village. So originally, a Puritan city, English city found during the colonial era, Charlestown proper was founded in 1628 and settled July 4th, 1629 by Thomas Graves, Increase Noel, Simon Hoyt, the Reverend Francis Bright, Ralph Richard and William Sprague, and about 100 others who preceded the Great Migration that would take place in the coming decades. And John Winthrop's company stopped here for some time in 1630 before deciding to settle across the Charles River in Boston. And bad water from a single spring located near the tide line took the blame for an epidemic of sickness that broke out among the 1,100 settlers, and 200 would die. And I believe this sickness was, again, a waterborne illness known as cholera. So fortunately, though, John Winthrop encountered Reverend William Blackstone, or Blackstone, and he was an English immigrant who had arrived from Plymouth in 1623, and he migrated to Boston. He was a hermit. He lived alone. And he tried to evangelize and Christianize the Native Americans in the area. But this is basically it's a depiction of what Boston would have looked like when William Blackstone was there in 1628. And you can just see the three hills known as Tremont, and Tremont. So he lived alone on the western slope of Beacon Hill, Tremont. Now, Blackstone was Boston's first European settler, and he charitably extended a welcoming hand to John Winthrop and his flock, and this is a scene depicted by the Founders Monument on Boston Common. Okay. And he made friends with the Native Americans. He didn't shoot at them, didn't try to steal food from them. He made friends with them and traded with them. Again, a close-up of that. So, William Blackstone, or Blackstone, was an Anglican minister, and he was the first British settler in Boston. And he came here with a group of settlers. Among them were Fernando Gorges, who was a slaver, by the way. And in 1625, he decided to live alone on the Shawmut Peninsula, that's modern-day Boston, and thus he became the first European colonist to settle in Boston, and he stayed on land that is now Boston Common. So he, not the Puritans who arrived in 1630, was the first true Bostonian. And that's his depiction on the right. So that's Shawmut Peninsula. And Blackstone told Winthrop and his flock that, hey, we've got an excellent spring here of fresh water, and I'll share my water with you. And in fact, the Indian name Shawmut supposedly means land of living waters. And again, you can just see an aquifer. The name is derived from Mashawamuk, or which is an Algonquian word of uncertain meaning. And Blackstone was the first settler to use the word Shawmut to describe the peninsula. So on the right, you can see Boston. It looked like a promontory, a causeway going out, or Boston Neck it was called. And during the Revolution, the British would block off this neck here, but it was, for all intent and purpose, an island that the British would occupy. And there are three hills as well, among them Beacon Hill. So the Great Spring, and this is why Boston was settled, because of the Great Spring. It was located on the north side of what is now Beacon Hill. And the Puritans accepted, and they acquired the land on the peninsula from Blackstone and the Chickatawbut, the Native American sachem. And the clean and abundant water supply was so important that Winthrop's Puritans not only crossed the Mystic River and relocated on the Shawmut Peninsula, but they built their settlement around it near the Beacon Hill. And their settlement would eventually become today's Boston. And that's it. That's the street. And you can visit that next time you're in Boston. It's underneath on Boston's Spring Lane, which is a dark, crooked alley. It's safe, don't worry. That connects Washington Street, which was then known as Cornhill Street, which was the main thoroughfare in ancient Boston, but it connects with Devonshire Street. And you can look it up on a map, Spring Lane. And I went there this past winter, and it was kind of cool because they covered it up and then they reburied it. But anyways, the Great Spring was reliable. It provided water to the citizens of Boston for over 200 years into the early 19th century. Just after the War of 1812, they stopped using it. In other springs, they dug shallow wells and cisterns to collect the rainwater, supplemented its output as the population grew until a municipal water system took over in 1848. So again, that's the plaque there you can see about the Great Spring. Really cool. That's why Boston was settled in that area. So the spring was covered up, then it was uncovered again in the 19th century and then paved over. Thus, Boston's original source of fresh water, the single most important resource for the city's founding fathers, simply disappeared in the early 19th century. And although one could say Boston was born on Spring Lane, the commuters hurrying along it to and from work have no clue as to the historical importance of the Great Spring. Spring Lane, there it is today, and you can find that. And they also don't understand Water Street, which runs parallel to Spring Lane, because that retains an indirect connection to the spring that was just around the corner. And the spring was no different from the water cooler of today's offices. That's where the news came. That's where people gossiped. That's where people found out about what was going on in the town and political gatherings and the like. This is long before the Liberty Tree in Boston. So another plaque reads, "This excellent spring water on the Shawmut Peninsula drew the Puritans to settle here. The site of the spring is marked on Spring Lane, and nearby the colonists built their compact town. The first church, first market, first prison, first burial ground, and the house of the first governor all stood close together, all around the spring. Today, two major landmarks, the old State House and King's Chapel, stood on the edges of the site of the early town center." So that's what we're talking about, where that red arrow is. Spring Lane. So while the Great Spring was a plentiful source for a small community, it became overburdened with colonial expansion and growth, and it got polluted too. This led to residents in today's Faneuil Hall to form the first waterworks system in 1652, which consisted of wooden pipes and a reservoir for drinking and putting out fires that often occurred from houses built mainly of wood. There was a string of, I do another lecture called Great Fires of the History of Boston, and there was a string of arson fires in the 1640s and 1650s. There was a Sparky, and of course in Plymouth, they banned smoking outside. You could only smoke inside. My, how times have changed, because pipe embers were getting into the thatched roofs on windy days, so you could only smoke inside. But anyways, there was the first great Boston fire was 1676, which burned through Boston's North End. It actually burned down the first Paul Revere house, Paul Revere's family house. That's why the one you see today was built in 1676. It was the second house. Enough fire talk. But for more than a century afterwards, the city residents built wells and cisterns throughout Boston, but they were unable to fix the poor availability and the quality of water. There was no filtration. So, of course, wells were dug. And you can see here a fire on the right here, and they're pulling buckets out of the well to put out the fire. That's the Paul Revere house, by the way. So by 1673, Boston's population had swelled up to 18,000, and they were packed into a small area. And they were running out of fresh water as the demand from the Great Spring and other shallow wells caused the city to begin to look elsewhere for fresh water sources. And fire was a constant threat. And again, as I mentioned, the fire of 1676, and there was also a great fire that burned Faneuil Hall in 1760. That's what the fire from 1760 looked like. An engraving. I know I said no more fire talk, but again, you had wooden houses. So, Jamaica Pond. Yes, they drank out of Jamaica Pond. With Boston's population now over 20,000, the Aqueduct Corporation was formed in 1796, and they began bringing water from nearby Jamaica Pond for using wooden logs for an aqueduct to Boston. Of course, Jamaica Pond was also a source for ice harvesting. And the pond was located at the top of a hill, so the system relied on gravity to deliver the water to lower areas. And because of this, Beacon Hill and the North End, because they were higher up, were not served. They were higher in elevation. And as I mentioned, if you just joined, these are various pictures of the Quabbin that I took. This is Jamaica Pond, though. So it's a natural kettle depression formed by glacial action, and the pond itself covers about 68 acres and has an average depth of 25 feet, but it's actually 53 feet deep near the center. Pretty deep pond. And it's part of the Emerald Necklace of Parks in Boston, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted in 1892. That might be a walk for you if you want to. Just check out the Emerald Necklace now that we've gotten out of the cold weather. Thank goodness. So the name Jamaica derives from an Indian or Native American term meaning abundance of beavers. And there you can see that's Jamaica Pond at sunset. So the pond has an area, as I mentioned, 68 acres, 53 deep, and it's the largest natural freshwater body in the lower Charles River watershed. There's Jamaica Pond, an etching. So the Jamaica Plain Ice Company employed 350 men in 1874, and there was a great fire in Boston in 1872, and they harvested as much as 5,000 tons of ice per day from Jamaica Pond. That's 10,000 pounds. I'm sorry, that's 100,000 pounds. And of course, it was a great area to skate. They had a winter carnival there. All sorts of people skated on Jamaica Pond. And in fact, though, in 1929, the carnival was canceled by Mayor Curley because cracks appeared on the ice, and 50,000 ice skaters had to be evacuated off of Jamaica Pond. Nice picture there today. But it contained the best quality water, not today, only sold to the people who could afford it, who lived near the city. And by the 1820s, the city realized how diseased the water system had become and how necessary water sanitation was needed, and it could only provide 50,000 gallons per day. By 1829, the Charles River and Spot Pond, which is in Stoneham and one of my favorite ponds to kayak on, were being considered as alternate sources of fresh water for Boston. In the first quarter of the 19th century, again, early 1800s, as middle and upper class people paid increasing attention to cleanliness, that's when bathtubs started. Before then, they'd go to public baths and would bathe once a week. But they started buying bathtubs for their homes and patronizing new commercial bathing establishments and pursuing the medicinal benefits of water cures. The lack of cleanliness in the city's poorer neighborhoods appeared to endanger not only the people living there, but the health of all Bostonians. So again, the health of all Bostonians with water that was diseased, full of diseases, not clean, you could pick up cholera very, very quickly, and the bacteria that was present there. And by the 1830s, it was the newly arrived immigrants who suffered most from the lack of clean water. By the 1830s, you have Italians, Irish, Germans, Jewish people arriving in Boston. Of course, they were forced into they had no money when they arrived. They were forced into the tenements to the lower class areas where sanitation was hard to find, and they had to drink out of the same cisterns. And living in crowded tenements without decent sanitation, they were vulnerable to waterborne diseases, as I mentioned, cholera, typhus, yellow fever, and these were spread by mosquitoes that bred in the stagnant tank water. And there were major cholera outbreaks in Boston in 1832 and 1848. 2 bad years in Boston. Now, Lake Cochituate, another kayak spot what I like. After decades of arguing over the next course of action, and with Boston's population now over 100,000, water company owners agreed in 1848 to build a municipal water system available to the public using Long Pond, which was renamed Lake Cochituate Reservoir, in Natick, Wayland, and Framingham. And they form 3 basins, the North, Middle, and South Basin. It's a huge area. There's a photograph. Now, its genesis dates back to 1845 when a Sudbury River tributary was impounded to form the artificial lake with 17 miles of watershed, 2 billion U.S. gallons, and a yield of 10 million U.S. gallons per day. Huge water source. And it became the cornerstone of Boston's public water system with a catchment area of 17 square miles and a maximum length of 3.76 miles covering 625 acres. It's an enormous three-pond area, Lake Cochituate. That's from the air. And normally I kayaked on the lower left-hand corner here, go under that bridge, and then kayak into the other two lakes. The 62-foot Cochituate Dam was built in 1890, replacing two earlier wooden dams dating back to the 1846 construction of the Cochituate Aqueduct. And that's the old dam today. So, construction of a 14.5-mile aqueduct cost $4 million in late 19th century, and it involved metal and cast iron pipes as more reservoirs were being created to serve everyone, including poorer parts of the city and surrounding areas. So the Cochituate Aqueduct brought water to Boston from 1848 all the way up until 1951, and it formed a key link in Boston's first major water supply system. But the project employed over 3,000 men as engineers, bricklayers, iron casters, and unskilled laborers, people that cut down trees and dug ditches. And there's a sketch of Lake Cochituate back in the day. That building still stands. So again, the aqueduct was built in 1846 to 1848 to convey water from Lake Cochituate to the Brookline Reservoir, and it passed through Natick, Wayland, Wellesley, Newton, and Brookline. And from there, pipelines ran to small distribution reservoirs throughout Boston, including Beacon Hill Reservoir atop Beacon Hill. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But this is essentially how the aqueduct flowed. Because what they had to do is pump water from one reservoir to another reservoir, and then pump it from that reservoir to another one with pumping stations. But you can see how it passed through Brookline. And here's construction. And they had African American laborers working for them when they were digging the tunnels and the aqueducts. Tough work. These photos are from the 1880s. So, Frog Pond. On October 25th, 1848, at Frog Pond, a fountain of water shot 80 feet high to inaugurate the city's first public water supply. The ceremony on Boston Common drew between 100,000 and 300,000 people, as this replaced the city's cisterns, wells, and springs, giving citizens a steady supply of pure drinking water for the first time. And there's a frog to this day on top of the house at Frog Pond. The mayor gave the children the next day off from school so they could swim in the pond. There you go. Now, the Frog Pond was so identified with the city that Edgar Allan Poe, when he was living in Boston, was born here, and he used it to insult Boston's transcendentalist writers. He found their work didactic and moralizing, employing obscurity for obscurity's sake, and he likened writers like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and James Russell Lowell to the croaking of frogs, and he called them Frogpondians. Oh! There's Longfellow. I like Longfellow. And that's Russell Lowell. And the frog. And that post statue is downtown Boston. So, Lower Falls Aqueduct had a break in 1859. And this is the only tragedy or near tragedy. It was March 29th, 1859, and the aqueduct let go in Lower Falls, Newton Lower Falls, at its connection with the pipes crossing the Charles River on the westerly side in what was Needham, and carries the pipes, gravel, brick and stone masonry into the Charles River, causing it to overflow its banks and throw back water upon the meadows and mills above. And that's a site of the disaster. A young man by the name of Ware, when he saw this happening, he rode his horse out to Lake Cochituate to tell the men of the breach, and the water was turned off. He saved the towns of Needham, Newton, Dedham, West Roxbury. And he was given a gold watch and chain from the Waltham Watch Factory, which is just down the road from me along the Charles. Now, this is a cool one, Beacon Hill Reservoir. It occupied a site on the top of Beacon Hill, bounded by Dern Street, Hancock Street, Temple Street, and Mount Vernon Street. And it could hold 2.6 million U.S. gallons, and it covered 37,000 square feet. But by 1876, the reservoir no longer distributed water, but rather functioned as a storage facility, and it was eventually dismantled in the early 1880s. Right there, the Beacon Hill Reservoir. And I have a picture here. Ready? Look at that. So the rain flowed. It was a huge cistern. And of course, it wasn't the cleanest water either. And mosquitoes and horseflies must have been awful around there. So the ceremony to lay the cornerstone of this new reservoir at Beacon Hill took place on November 13th, 1847, but here's where tragedy struck. At 11:30, the ring at the head of the mast of the derrick to which the final stone was suspended broke and slightly injured a little boy and broke the leg of a little girl by the name of Frances Maria Hobbs, and doing considerable damage at the works, so the laying of the stone was consequently postponed. Of course, people thought it was jinxed. And you can see there was Josiah Quincy Jr. was the mayor at that time. Nathan Hale, the commissioner. Another lane on Quabbin Reservoir. Again, if you get a chance, spring, but beware, make sure you use tick repellent. And the best thing to do is, if you go walking in the Quabbin Reservoir, stay in the middle, don't go through grassy areas, and try to tie off your pants and wear light-colored pants and check every mile to see if there's any ticks. Trust me. So there's the reservoir where the red arrow is, the Beacon Hill Reservoir, and you can see the Boston Common to the right. And to the far right, you can see the Frog Pond Fountain. So 2 years later, the building was complete, and on the morning of November 23rd, 1849, quote, the water was let into it through the 30-inch pipe at 9:30, and it was filled in 18 and a half hours. And that's a rare photograph. See that in the foreground of the Beacon Hill Reservoir. Pretty cool photo. Now, the Chestnut Hill Reservoir. It was a reservoir that was created from 1865 to 1870 on existing marshes and meadowlands to supplement the city of Boston's water needs. And today it does serve as an emergency water source for Boston should something happen to the piping from Quabbin. And there you see. Now, the Mystic Lakes system in Winchester, Medford, and Arlington, which had been developed by Charlestown, was added to the Boston system when Charlestown was annexed by Boston. And I think this is the lower Mystic Lake. And the lake system had a yield of 30 million gallons per day from its 28 square mile watershed. And a portion of the original water mains to Charlestown is still in service. You're talking 180 years old. So let's take a look at the map. To the left, we have Wachusett, and we're going to talk about that reservoir in a second. It comes in from Wachusett Reservoir via aqueduct into Lake Cochituate, and then leaves via the Weston Aqueduct into Newton, Brookline, and then on into Boston. So the Sudbury Reservoir, which is 2.02 square miles, is an emergency backup reservoir as of 1976, Boston Metropolitan Reservoir in Massachusetts. It's located predominantly in Southborough and Marlborough, with small sections in Westborough and Framingham. The point being, it's not in Sudbury. It was created when the Sudbury Dam was constructed to impound the Stony Brook branch of the Sudbury River, but no part of the reservoir lies in the town of Sudbury. There it is. So the main sources of the Quabbin Reservoir of water are the Quabbin Reservoir today, Wachusett Reservoir, and the Ware River. And the 8 billion gallon reservoirs cover 1,500 acres. So the reservoir was first begun in 1878 as part of a system of reservoirs fed from the Sudbury River to supplement the Lake Cochituate system in Natick. We're talking about the Sudbury Reservoir. And the water began to fill the Sudbury Reservoir on February 8, 1897. Not that long ago. And there you go. There's the construction. A lot of men on top there. This is the aqueduct and dam. And again, it was built in 1897 in the Sudbury Stony Brook branch, the Sudbury River. The dam was finally completed, and the reservoir was fed from the Wachusett Reservoir on the west by the Wachusett Aqueduct, which was built in 1898, again using local streams. So the reservoir's water was delivered to the Weston Reservoir to the east by the Weston Aqueduct, completed in 1901, or via a channel to the Framingham Reservoirs and the Sudbury Aqueduct to the Chestnut Hill Reservoir. I know I'm confusing you. Now the Sudbury Aqueduct runs for 16 miles from Farm Pond at Waverly Street in Framingham to Chestnut Hill Reservoir in Boston's Chestnut Hill. And it was constructed between 1875 and 1878, with Boston's population climbing to 300,000, and it was in use for almost 100 years. This is Echo Bridge, by the way, in Newton. And it was designed to carry water from the watershed of the Sudbury River to Boston and its surrounding communities. And the Boston metropolitan area, though, continued to grow rapidly through the 1890s. Again, post-Civil War, there was another influx of immigrants that come in from Europe and also from Asia as well. And Boston was growing rapidly. So indoor plumbing soon became commonplace. Before that, you had outhouses. And planners had not foreseen this development, and therefore the water supply had become inadequate by the late 19th century. So the Wachusett Reservoir, that's another nice reservoir you might want to take a walk around. Really nice walk. Work began in 1897 and was completed in 1905 on a 7-mile-long, 1-mile-wide reservoir that held 65 billion gallons. And the Nashua River above the town of Clinton was impounded, blocked off, by the Wachusett Dam, and 6.5 square miles were flooded in the towns of Boylston, West Boylston, Clinton, and Sterling. So like the Quabbin Reservoir, some of these towns lost land to the Wachusett Reservoir. And its water conveyed by the Wachusett Weston Aqueduct to Weston Reservoir, and then by pipeline to the Chestnut Hill and Spot Pond Reservoirs. So again, Wachusett, then into Weston, Framingham, all the way through Chestnut Hill into Boston. They daisy-chained the reservoirs. That way they could have pumping stations along the way. And that's Wachusett Reservoir. Again, a nice walk. Nice, pretty ample parking as well. And at this time, at the turn of the 20th century, the Wachusett Reservoir was the largest public water supply reservoir in the world. It was an engineering marvel. There you go. This is an iconic image, an abandoned church. It's almost like that motif up in Rockport. Motif number 1, did they call it that red shed? But it's the old stone church in West Boylston, and it was left remaining as a reminder of those who lost their homes and jobs and land due to the building of the reservoir. But it's one of the most photographed sites in the area, and that's the money shot right there in the autumn. Everybody's out there. I was out there just as the trees were turning in late October last year, and there were painters, photographers, and even a man doing a pencil sketch. So at the turn of the 20th century, the following sources were considered for additional water. They needed more water: the Nashua River, Lake Winnipesaukee, Sebago Lake, and the Merrimack River. And now, what you've come for, and now the Quabbin Reservoir. So, the maximum length of the Quabbin Reservoir is 18 miles with a surface area of 38.6 square miles and an average depth of 51 feet. A maximum depth of 150 feet with a water volume of 412 billion gallons. The shore length of 181 miles with a surface elevation of 522 feet, touching the communities of Belchertown, Petersham, Hardwick, Ware, New Salem, Shutesbury, and Pelham. The Quabbin. I took that photo. When I did my tour to Quabbin, my 21 walks, I inadvertently walked to Shutesbury. I'm walking about 6 miles into my walk, and a gentleman comes by on the bike, and I said, is the reservoir this way? He says, the reservoir, it's back that way, like 8 miles. So it ended up being a 14-mile walk. So if you're out there with cell phones. You don't get cell phone service in some areas. But the Quabbin Reservoir is the largest inland body of water in Massachusetts, and it was built between 1930 and 1939. And today, along with the Wachusett Reservoir, is the primary water supply for Boston, some 65 miles to the east, as well as 40 other communities in the greater Boston area. It also supplies water to 3 towns west of the reservoir, and it acts as a backup supply for 3 others. So a lot of people depend on Quabbin. It supplies water for nearly 3 million people. And the water flows to the Wachusett Reservoir using the Quabbin Aqueduct. Again, that's how they daisy chain them, via aqueducts and pumping stations. In 1893, the Massachusetts Board of Health issued a report analyzing population and water use trends, and they recommended the creation of a metropolitan water district, eventually the MDC, and served several suburban communities in addition to Boston, and the construction of 2 new reservoirs, one on the Nashua River northeast of Worcester and one in the Swift River Valley. The General Court acted to establish the Metropolitan Water District, including 26 communities within 10 miles of the Massachusetts State House, later in the year 1895. So the Board of Health study had anticipated that Swift River water would be required by 1915, or Boston would be run out of water. But this prediction had proven overly pessimistic. And the introduction of mandatory water metering in water district communities and other efforts to reduce waste and inefficient uses made it possible to delay construction of new water sources until the 1930s. We take water for granted here in the East. I mean, the Southwest, as you know, it's becoming desertified again. And there's all sorts of water wars going on there. But the Quabbin, was 2 years ago when I did my tour to Quabbin, it was at about 70% capacity. Last year when I did my walks, it was at 95% capacity. So Frank Windsor was the chief engineer for the Metropolitan Water District from 1926 until his death in 1939. And he was closely involved in the design and construction of Windsor Dam, Goodnoe Dyke, and the Quabbin Reservoir. Again, 2 good drives out there, Windsor Dam and Goodnoe Dyke. Nice walks, sweeping vistas of the Quabbin. I highly recommend it for a Sunday drive. And Windsor Dam is named after Frank Windsor, and he had previously been the chief engineer for the building of the Scituate Reservoir in Rhode Island. So this was his brainchild. And a 1922 study officially endorsed the Swift River Valley as the next extension of the water system, and they created the MDC, the Metropolitan District Commission, now the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority, the MWRA, to oversee the construction and maintain the system after its completion. And in 1926, the Ware River Act was passed, starting construction on the first stage of the project, a 12-mile-long tunnel connecting Wachusett Reservoir with the Ware River. And this is called the Ware River Diversion, and during the 1930s, this tunnel was extended to the Swift River. And the complete tunnel is now known as the Quabbin Aqueduct. That's what we're talking about. Okay, so there's the red line right across your screen there. The Quabbin Aqueduct moving to the east through the Wachusett watershed into Wachusett Reservoir. So, yes, we're getting water kind of from the Quabbin Reservoir. It's actually going through the Wachusett Reservoir as well. By the way, that's a beach. You can have a beach day on the Quabbin Reservoir. Just take in what you take out, or take out what you take in. But there's a nice beach there and quiet. And you can see the jumpers from Orange with their planes circling over the parachutists. I did see a bear there, though. And he didn't see me. I ran. Although the project was enthusiastically supported by lawmakers in the Boston area, obviously it was opposed by residents of the affected towns. And the state of Connecticut then sued Massachusetts, claiming that waters that were rightfully meant to flow into Connecticut River and subsequently through their state was being illegally diverted. So the lawsuit was unsuccessful, but Massachusetts, still bound by discharge minimums set under the regulatory authority of the Secretary of War over navigable waters, specifically the Swift River needed to maintain a 20 million gallon per day flow downriver from the dam to satisfy the residents of Connecticut. It's, far right here, this is Goodnoe Dyke here, right? Beautiful walk. You love it. It's about an hour drive from Westwood. So before the reservoir's construction, there was a hill in Enfield called Quabbin Hill and a lake in Greenwich. Some call it Greenwich, others say Greenwich, called Quabbin Lake. And these were from the Nipmuc Indian word meaning place of many waters or meeting of many waters, and these became the basis for naming the new reservoir, Quabbin. Now, the Quabbin was formed by inundating the Swift River Valley and a drainage basin lying entirely within the state by damming the river and a col through which Beaver Brook would have otherwise provided another outlet for its water. So when construction on the dam began in the mid-1930s, the Swift River was redirected from its riverbed through a diversion tunnel. So while they were digging out the Quabbin and leveling the trees and leveling the homes and picking up the homes and moving them, they had to divert the water. So Quabbin Reservoir was Boston's fourth westward reach for a pure upland source of water that could be delivered by gravity and not require filtration. Chestnut Hill, Lake Cochituate, and Wachusett. So construction of the Quabbin required impoundment of the Swift River, blocking it off, and they had to take the towns of Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott. And there was some uproar. Joe Kennedy was running, saying, I forget who his opponent is. I don't pay attention to politics anymore. But that they didn't campaign in the towns of Dana, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott, and they were mocked for that. So August 14th, 1939, that tunnel was sealed with rock. And over the next 7 years, the waters of the Quabbin Reservoir slowly rose behind the newly completed Windsor Dam, an earth-filled structure 2,640 feet long, rising 170 feet above the riverbed and the slightly smaller Goodnoe Dike. It's spectacular. And that's an overlook, by the way. The water gradually submerged the roads that had linked the towns, and it swallowed all but the peaks of about 60 hills and mountains, transforming Prescott Ridge into Prescott Peninsula. And the Quabbin Reservoir was full for the first time in June of 1946. In 1941, the land that would become the Prescott Peninsula became the Quabbin Reservoir Precision Bombing and Gunnery Range. They started using it for bombing when the World War II broke out. And of course, they began releasing rattlesnakes into the area. There's a road called Rattlesnake Den. And I went down there and I said, you know something? I'm not going to go down Rattlesnake Den. So the range was used by the Army Air Forces and later the U.S. Air Force planes from both Hanscom Army Airfield and the Westover Army Airfield from 1941 through 1951. The Army Air Force became eventually the Air Force. So the Quabbin's creation required the flooding and thus the disincorporation in April of 1938 of four towns: Dana, which was located in Worcester County, Enfield, Greenwich, and Prescott, which were all located in Hampshire County. And the land remaining from the disincorporated towns was added to surrounding municipalities, including Belchertown, Pelham, New Salem, Petersham, Hardwick, and Ware. And one additional town on the reservoir is Shutesbury, which is in Franklin County. And the Shays Rebellion, and pretty cool, Daniel Shays hid out around before Quabbin Reservoir was built. He hid out in that area. And because of New Salem's annexation of the Prescott Peninsula, a large wedge of land shifted from Hampshire County to Franklin County, and today the majority of the reservoir lies in either the towns of New Salem or Petersham. So that just shows you those towns on the left are gone, and you can see how the Quabbin Reservoir was formed. So of the land used to make the dam, about 60,000 acres were purchased, and the rest was seized by eminent domain in 1938. They gave you a price that you could not refuse. It was lowball, and a lot of people refused when they had their land taken from them. But the town of Dana voted to voluntarily give up their land to the project, and around 2,500 residents lost their homes as part of the flooding. In addition, 36 miles of the Boston and Albany Railroad's Athol branch, the so-called Rabbit Run, were abandoned, originally the Springfield, Athol, and Northeastern Railroad. And that's a picture I took on Rabbit Run. That's where the rail bed ran at one time. There it is again. Yep, it was known as the Rabbit. a friendly train. Some books there, Quabbin Railroad. So Route 21, which is formerly reaching Athol, was truncated to the south side of the reservoir, and the new roads, which you travel today if you went to the reservoir, US 202, Daniel Shays Highway, and Route 32A, were built respectively on the western and eastern side of the reservoir. So there's Route 2 to the north of the reservoir, and then you can see 32A and 202, which go around the reservoir. Now, the designation of Route 109 was removed in 1933 from the road once running from Pittsfield to West Brookfield and leading into Enfield Center from the southeast. And a different road southwest of Boston received that designation. And you know today in Westwood what Route 109 was. And it wasn't the original 109. It's the new 109. So this is looking southerly from the knoll near the old Randall Farm. This is just before it was filled. Look at that. Marsh area. And this is Old Enfield here, I believe. 1916. And you can tell it's near the 4th of July, right? See the sign? July 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, 1916. What's going on there? The Red Sox are doing well playing at Fenway Park. Of course, World War I is underway, and the U.S. is about to get pulled into it with the sinking of Lusitania. Fireworks for sale. To the right. I love old photos. And this is the destruction of the town in the mid-1930s to late 1930s as they had to remove every home, knock down telephone poles. A lot of the houses were moved themselves. So this is maybe 1938. The town hall, again, I'm thinking about 38. And here it is. There's a town hall in the background. As you can see, the bulldozers clearing the brush. And again, giving you a view, the bottom is the site when it was flooded. That's a 1987 photograph. 1939, you can see the middle one just after it was cleared. And then Enfield, Mass, 1927, before the reservoir was built. So that gives you the genesis of the reservoir. Let's talk individual towns of the 4 that we lost. Enfield. Here's a picture of Enfield. Nice community. Everybody knew everybody there. Again, all of this is underwater today. The railroad stop, that's where the Rabbit Run came through. Wabbit 1. And there's a woman there outside the train station on a cold winter's day, driving into town to the general store. This is Quabbin Lake, which was near Enfield, Mass., the only body of water out there which was absorbed into the Quabbin Reservoir. And again, this looks like it's a 4th of July or Labor Day celebration. The Ferrens house in Enfield. Today, if you dove on it, and you can't, you have to get special permits, and the red tape you have to go through is enormous. But there's some empty basements there, and they make great habitats for large fish. That's the town hall with its spire there. And you can see the town hall again sitting in the back as they clear the brush. Enfield. From the air, just before it was decimated. Bird's eye view of Enfield. The Enfield Cornet Band. Sgt. Pepper's Enfield Lonely Hearts Cornet Band. Greenwich. Nice. The railroad station, the Wabbit 1 in Greenwich. Quabbin Lake. Again, Quabbin Lake from Hales Bridge. There were different sections of Greenwich, including Greenwich proper, Greenwich Village, and a place called Huntington. There's Dad with his daughter, probably a hot summer day, relaxing. Horse and buggy to the left there. Life was simpler then, wasn't it? This looks like a lumber being stacked near the rail track. Again, Greenwich off in the distance. picking up the mail. You can see in the background there's smoke. So this is, you can see the tire tracks. They were clearing out the Quabbin Valley at this point. So she was not long for that place. The Town Hall and Congregational Church in Greenwich. This is known as a Quabbin House. Now, there's debate about what's a Quabbin House. Some people say if every single board was moved from the house, it's a Quabbin House. Other people took one floor or roof of their house and moved it. So there's always been debate as to what is a true or pure Quabbin House. And here's somebody, look at that. Pack up the truck, Grandpa, and take the house on the road. We're moving. Some were moved as far as Connecticut. I visited a couple Quabbin houses. Very sturdy construction. As you can see now, as they're starting to knock down all the houses and trees, they're getting ready to flood the valley, Swift River Valley. Prescott. Now, much of Prescott is above water on what is known as the Prescott Peninsula. There you go, the Quabbin Reservoir, Prescott Peninsula Wilderness Area. I had gotten a one-day permit to go out there, and it poured like the dickens. Last year I couldn't go, so hopefully this year. But Prescott cannot be visited most of the year due to state restrictions, but there is an annual tour of the town conducted by the Swift River Historical Society. I'm trying to get that date now. And that's the Swift River Historical Society. Quabbin House. And this is a cool sign here, just showing you where's North Prescott was this way in Cooleyville. Oh, there's Cooleyville Road. There's like 5 Cooleyville roads. Watch out, because they go north, south, east, and west, and you can get lost on them. So a few houses in the roads, which were once part of the North Prescott, which is now New Salem, and there's a town line marker just north of the gates indicating the former town line for Prescott. And this was a get for me, this picture, to find that. Looked everywhere for it. It was right where I expected it to be, on the Prescott-New Salem line. But cellar holes have been filled near the center of what was once Prescott to accommodate the former 5-college radio astronomy observatory, which was once operated, now it's abandoned, by the University of Massachusetts Amherst. There you go. It used to be a radio observatory. And between you and I, that's a Strategic Air Command also had a radar site out there. There you see the construction going on. It's abandoned now. Another Quabbin house from Prescott. This is the old Prescott Town Hall. The first Congregational Church moved from its original location. That's where it was. That's where it is. Again, a family in front of their house. A townhouse. Again, there's the sign. I took that early last fall. A kiln. Again, barns. Dirt roads. Country living. In Prescott. 1900. There was North Prescott, a place called Soapstone. There's Soapstone Mountain, Prescott Hollow, and Prescott. And this is Colonel William Prescott, famous for Bunker Hill. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes, or something to that effect. He didn't say that, but basically, when he was holding out on Bunker Hill, he waited until these British columns came within gun range, and then they fired on them. So the buildings in the towns flooded by the reservoir were removed. Some cellar holes were left intact, while others, chiefly in Prescott and below the flow line, were filled in. Oh, and if you go walking there, some of the gates, miles and miles of stone walls. I try to conceive the labor. And you know stone walls in Westwood, you see them. But the labor, they were built over generations, just for miles. And of course, they delineated private property. Some great specials, by the way. GBH did a wonderful special back in the 90s on this. And old roads that once led to the flooded towns can now be followed to the water's edge. Look at this. See, that's the road, and it just drifts off, a ghost road into the Quabbin. Another road. Took that picture there. You can see the old asphalt. And then finally, Dana. So in order to protect the water supply from the threats from unrestricted motorized vehicle use, most areas around the reservoir are publicly accessible only by foot, with limited parking available at some of the surrounding gates. And large portions of Dana are on higher ground, and it remains predominantly cellar holes, as well as the former town center, where a historic stone marker was placed, can be visited. So this is where you can actually walk through with plaques, the former town of Dana. It's an easy walk. People over it. If you park at the gate, you need to walk about a half mile, 10 minutes. And so it's a nice walk, and they have plaques, and you can walk around and look at the foundations. And there's the old Dana Common stone. And again, there's a place called Nichawag where you park and you walk in. It's not that bad a walk. Gate 40 is where you want to go. Again, Dana Common, a historical stone, some foundations. And again, that's Dana Common. Pretty nice. They mow it. It's really well kept. And that the roads are nice and flat. And even if you can even have a picnic there and then head back to your car at Gate 40. One of the houses, this is a photograph of a photograph. Again, that's what Dana Common used to look like. This was a cool foundation, a wealthy person's house, but look at the stones, the stonework there. Do you know, not only putting those stones up, and there's no mortar, but finding the proper shapes. I just can't comprehend that. The engineering behind this. Dana. There was industry there. This is a grapevine. Look at the vineyard. See that? Again, today's Dana Common. Nice area. I really enjoyed it. The Rabbit Run. Again, the train station. Dana. Dana Common. The old church. Again, that stone foundation. Look at the craftsmanship. And again, if you went to Dana Common today, park at Gate 40, then you can see the site of the old town hall, school, churches, the old store, the old Eagle Hotel. And this is what Dana looked like in 1857 on a map. A scenic inn. There was an overlook. Of course, watch your step. Don't go too near the foundations. And O.E. Hager, proprietor, North Dana. Groceries, crockery, hardware, boots, shoes, paints, oils. You name it, Hager's got it. But not all elements of the towns were destroyed, however. Town memorials and cemeteries in the four towns were moved to the Quabbin Park Cemetery, located on Route 9 in Ware, just off the Quabbin land. And they did miss some graves, because a lot of the people that lived there for generations, they buried their relatives on their land. So there were a lot of unmarked graves. But that's Quabbin Park Cemetery. Again, that's a beach at Quabbin Reservoir. Many other public buildings were moved intact to other locations. For example, the Prescott First Congregational Church was moved to South Hadley, Massachusetts. There it is. The North Prescott Methodist Episcopal Church was moved to Orange in 1949 and then to New Salem in 1985, where it forms part of the building complex of the Swift River Valley Historical Society. And there she is. Kind of neat. Survived 2 moves. And the former town hall of Prescott now sits off of Route 32 in Petersham, right there. We're almost done here. In July 2020, Representative Joe Kennedy III, as I mentioned, criticized Senator Ed Markey for ignoring these 4 Quabbin towns that were no longer in existence in a debate while challenging him in the Senate Democratic primary. There's a visitor center south of the reservoir, as well as an observation tower and Enfield Lookout. Again, there's the observation tower. Pretty good drive. Enfield Lookout. Trees are much higher than that now. Enfield Lookout again. It's a really nice drive. I mean, you couldn't do it all in one day, obviously. You take 2 or 3 trips out there, but just pick where you want to go, and it's called Quabbin Park. It's accessible by car from the south using State Route 9, and again, hiking, other outdoor activities, picnics, and the like. And it was formerly part of Enfield, which was annexed by Belchertown. There it is in the autumn. So the large block of forested land supports a great diversity of wildlife. It's been the focus for reestablishment of several species in Massachusetts, including bald eagles. I saw 3 or 4 bald eagles when I was out there. Black bears, saw 1. Loons, moose, deer, coyotes, foxes, bobcats, and somebody even told me Bigfoot. But you can see bears, eagles, loons, moose, deer, moose, coyote, or fox, bobcat. And some say there's even mountain lions out there. I narrated a documentary called Lions of the East that came out in 2020, right as the pandemic hit. It got no airplay. Sold like 20 copies. Anyways, conclusive mountain lion evidence, and I believe there are mountain lions in Massachusetts. Yes, there are. Was found in Pelham, Mass. In the spring of 1997. I saw footprints of in 1993 in Easton, Mass., which were cougars. And of course, there's Cape Cod lore of the Chiquesset cougar, the beast of Truro, on Cape Cod, where they saw a wildcat in the early 1980s. Anyways, they decided it was an escaped exotic pet and not native to the area. No. They're breeding viable catamount populations in Massachusetts and New England. Deal with it. So, then they even saw a mountain lion feeding on a deer carcass as well, and it's not an exotic pet. Sorry. But history records 1858 as the year the last Massachusetts mountain lion was killed. Officially, there are no resident mountain lions in Massachusetts. Tell that to the woman I spoke with outside of Springfield, Mass., who lost one of her young goats to a mountain lion. And that's the documentary that nobody bought, Lions of the East, 2020. Okay, let's move on here. So, Gate 44, Shaft 12, there are 2 island causeways. Jot that down. Gate 40 will get you to Dana, Town Common. Gate 44 will get you to Shaft 12 and 2 island causeways. And I did 6 1/4 miles in 3 hours walking. That was stage 10. And again, country lanes, roads, dirt paths. It's really, really nice walk. And if you get the weather, it's just a marvelous rejuvenating walk, and that's one of the causeways. So neat. And you could actually get a cell phone reception there on that causeway. And again, another causeway. Just beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. I'm not a fisherman, but I'm sure you could pull up some fish there too, but it's illegal. You got to get a fishing permit. The pump house. So I can't tell you every single story that I've gathered about the old Quabbin towns of Enfield, Prescott, Dana, and Greenwich, so please feel free to share them with me at the conclusion of my presentation. But just to go over in closing, Quabbin timeline, 10,000 BC, that's when the last glacial age ends in New England. The Swift River and the valley landscape is sculpted by receding glaciers. 4,000 BC, the Pocumtuck and Nipmuc Indians inhabit the Swift River Valley. Imagine that, 4,000 BC. And, of course, they could fish. There was all sorts of game there. 1736, they grant 1,000 acres to the white man. The first church shows up in Swift River in Greenwich in 1744. A saw and a grist mill to grind corn are built in Greenwich by a man named Holmes, 1745. Quabbin becomes a parish, 1749. 1754, Greenwich is incorporated, and the first town meeting is held. Conkey's Tavern, important to have a pub, is erected in what will become Prescott in 1758. In 1770, the dams constructed in the valley by Ephraim Woodard. He operated a sawmill. The Enfield Congregational Church is erected in 1788. 1787, as I told you, Shays' Rebellion. The event was actually plotted at Conkey's Tavern in the future town of Prescott. And again, the men running from the local militia over the next year, they were fighting taxation. They hid out around the Quabbin Reservoir. The 6th Massachusetts Turnpike is built connecting the Swift River Valley to Amherst. I have a lecture on YouTube called Bay State Roads and Trails about the beginning of an old trails, whether it's the Bay Path, the Worcester Turnpike, Old Connecticut Path. It's on YouTube if you want to see it. All the old roads that we have in Massachusetts. 1801, Dana comes along. 1810, Greenwich has a post office. 1812, a dam at Smith Station in Enfield is built. A sawmill is erected in North Dana. 1816, Enfield's incorporated. They have a town budget of $1,666.67. Swift River Company is established in Enfield, manufactures cotton, 1821. Prescott's incorporated in 1822. Boston becomes a city the same year, 1822, and 100 gallons of water is used daily by each Boston family. That's a lot of water. Dana Post Office, 1823. Greenwich Village Post Office, 1824. And Swift River, again, Dana, 1830, had 623 people. Enfield, 1,056. Greenwich, 813. And Prescott, 758. And by 1832, the Swift River Hotel is erected in Enfield. The Flag Tavern is built in 1835, later called the Eagle Hotel in Dana. The palm, now in Greenwich, they manufactured these palm leaf hats, and they made 30,000 hats valued at $4,375. Not each, but that was world famous. People in Europe were buying these palm leaf hats. And I'm sure today, if you looked at them, ladies, they'd be hideous, or maybe so cool you could wear them on Halloween. But everybody wanted a palm leaf hat. And Dana adds parts of Hardwick, 1842, North Prescott Post Office, Soapstone Quarry. They started to mine soapstone from the area in 1852. And it was easy stone to chisel. And then the railroad is built in 1873. The Rabbit Run eventually has 20 stops along its 47 miles. The Rabbit Run, by the way, there are so many nice stories elderly people told me about. You could ask the conductor to stop the train wherever you wanted. He'd let you off, pick flowers, and let you back on. First survey of Swift River, 1895. Boston, by 1895, has over 500,000, and the metropolitan area, including the suburbs of Dedham and Westwood, exceeds 1 million. The Quabbin Club, which was a prominent women's club in the valley, forms in Enfield in 1897, and the Mass Drainage Committee forms in 1899. Swift River now, here are the town populations at the turn of the 20th century. Dana, 790. Enfield, 1,036. Greenwich, 491. Prescott, 380. There's a bit of a decline. 1901, Dana is 100 years old. 1904, Greenwich is 150 years old. Enfield is 100 years old in 1916. Of course, the war is going on. MDC is created. Swift River Valley in 1920, Dana 599, Enfield 790, Greenwich 399, and Prescott 236. Boston population over 750,000, or near 750,000. So again, they're looking in 1921, doing a survey of the Swift River Valley. They're eyeing it to expand it and create a reservoir. MDC says it's recommended taking water from the Ware River and flooding the Swift River Valley. Prescott is 100 years old in 1922. Prescott Post Office closes and mail is routed through Greenwich. 1926, the Ware River Act passes, basically appropriating funds for the construction of a 12-mile-long aqueduct from Ware River to Wachusett Reservoir. MDWSC is set up. Frank Windsor joins the project in 1926 as chief engineer. 1927, the Swift River Act passes, appropriating money for the construction of a reservoir in the Swift River Valley. North Prescott Post Office closes in 1927. Project begins, and Prescott holds its last town meeting in 1928. So by 1930, 40,000 acres of land were purchased by the MDWSC. Dana residents decide to leave, and the population is now in 1930, seeing the writing on the wall: Dana 595, Enfield 497, Greenwich 238, Prescott only 48. By 1931, the Supreme Court says yes, Massachusetts. It rules in favor of Massachusetts in their lawsuit with Connecticut. They have to allow Connecticut some water. And now they came just in the nick of time because Wachusett Reservoir was being drained. It dropped to only 19% of its capacity. And finally, on March 20th, 1931, the first water is diverted from the Ware River. And again, they decide in 1932 to call it Quabbin. In 1933, the aqueduct is completed. In 1933, the Quabbin Cemetery is dedicated. They move all the graves from the surrounding towns. They divert the water through the tunnel. They purchased 60,000 acres to date. They were, by the way, the people that cut down the trees were called woodpeckers. And the people in the area that were still living there resented them because they were loud, foul-mouthed, and they'd show up in their taverns and start fights. A Rabbit Run, Final Run, 1935. Daniel Shays Highway, Route 202, opens in 35. Last Factory closes. And now 1935, just before they flooded, Dana, 387 people. Enfield, 495. Greenwich, 219. Prescott, 18. And again, these woodpeckers in 1936 show up. They clear it to 10 feet above the flood line. And again, there was a lot of resentment. There was a huge flood of 1936. Look that up. You had the hurricane in 1938. The huge flood through the Swift River Valley flooded the Connecticut River in 1936. 6.11 inches of rain fell in 14 days. Swift River Historical Society, 1936. Enfield Congregational Church is destroyed by arson. They think woodpeckers, atheists, set that church on fire. Again, there was a lot of enmity towards it. And now, this is pretty cool, the final ball, the final night of the town. Seeing your neighbors for the last time. It's April 28th, and the year is 1938. Enfield, Greenwich, Dana, and Prescott disincorporated, and there's a farewell ball held in the Enfield Town Hall, and as the clock struck midnight, the band played Old Lang Syne, and Enfield became part of the Quabbin Reservoir. And September 21st, that same year, a powerful hurricane strikes, 11.6 inches of rain falls in 5 days, and the level of the Swift River is risen by 15 feet at Windsor Dam. And 50 million board feet of timber were blown down in the hurricane of 38. In fact, they say 2 billion trees were lost in New England alone with the hurricane of 38. So they begin to fill it up in 39, and then the first diversion of the Ware River put in place. The peninsula is used, Prescott Peninsula, for bombing by the Army Air Corps. And then the Quabbin Tower is completed in 41. The dam and the dike are open to the public. And then by 46, it was filled to capacity at 530 feet above Boston City base level. It cost about $53 million. 20 cities and towns served. Shore fishing was allowed in 1946. In 1967, a huge drought. The Quabbin fell 34.3 feet below capacity. It was only 45% full. And then the radio telescope was built in 1969. And the Quabbin Reservoir reached capacity in 1976. And then by 1980, 44 communities being served, 343 million gallons per day. And in 1982, they released bald eagles at Quabbin, and they're still flourishing today. And Quabbin in 1984, I don't know if you remember that, but May and early June of 1984, we had torrential rains here in Boston and Massachusetts, and it was 103% of capacity, 531.8 feet above sea level. So that's the Quabbin Reservoir, former Mass towns, Prescott, Greenwich, Dana, and Enfield. So long. That's what it looks like today and where the towns would have been. And that's one of my favorite signs at the Historical Society. The farewell ball, the actual sign, where they danced until midnight. And that's my talk. So thank you so much for your patience. I know I zoomed through it. I'm a professional hockey announcer, and sometimes that slips through with my narration. But I want to thank you so much for attending tonight. If there's any questions, I'll open it up now. If anybody would like to ask a question, if you have a nice story, I'd love to hear it as well. Does anybody have a question? Okay. Well, thank you so much for attending this lecture. Thank you to the Westwood Public Library, to the Westwood Historical Society. My name's John Horrigan. This has been the Quabbin Reservoir. And please, if you get a chance, go out there. Take a ride out there on a nice sunny day and enjoy yourself, okay? Peace be with you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.